Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Today's event is clearly part of a full-scale and well-funded disinformation campaign against Russia, carried out by several NATO countries directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine, aimed at undermining peace efforts and justifying attacks on civilians in Russia. We invite all those interested in establishing the truth to abandon the Russophobic cliches being voiced and, using common sense, analyze other sources. Unfortunately, this will take longer than the 3 minutes stipulated by the rules, so I hope my speech will not be interrupted. After all, I suppose everyone came to hear what Russia has to say. Let's begin with the OZOV, namely, the root causes of the conflict. It's well known that Western countries brought to power in Ukraine, in 2014, people who declared the population of the country's southeast terrorists and launched a full-scale war against them, using tanks, aircraft, murder, and torture. Thus, the residents of Donbass were punished for their desire to speak Russian and have their own self-government. This tragedy has received no objective assessment from the UN or from anyone who today advocates for respect for international humanitarian law and human rights. This tragedy received support from Western overseers, and not just morally. These horrific events are currently being examined by the UN International Court of Justice, where Kyiv is the defendant in a case alleging violation of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. I suggest monitoring this process. Since the population of Donbass did not support Ukraine's inclusion in NATO's orbit, its destruction was advantageous to the alliance countries in order to draw Ukraine into this aggressive bloc, which for decades had been methodically and systematically advancing eastward toward Russia's borders. Moscow persistently and patiently urged its member countries to adhere to the principle of indivisible security in Europe that they had agreed upon. However, in response, we invariably encountered either cynical deception or attempts at pressure and blackmail, while the bloc's war machine moved inexorably toward our doorstep. One of these stages of this deception was the Minsk agreements, the conclusion of which, as the Western signatories themselves acknowledged, was necessary for Kyiv's rearmament. The culmination of this course was the armed escalation in Donbass in 2022. We invite all interested parties to review the OSCE-SMM ceasefire violation reports in Donbass these days. They are publicly available. They clearly demonstrate that Kyiv was the one attacking Donbass. And it was under these circumstances, following an official request for assistance from the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, that Russia decided to conduct a special military operation in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. The crisis in Ukraine was orchestrated and continues to be fueled by Western countries that are so ostensibly concerned about the rights of individuals in the conflicts involved. Among these countries, the United Kingdom occupies a prominent place. Back in 2016, it signed a memorandum of military cooperation with Kyiv, under which the two sides began exchanging intelligence. Britain began training Ukrainian troops. It is therefore unsurprising that in the spring of 2022, when the parameters of a peace settlement were practically finalized during the Istanbul talks, then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson scuttled the agreement and ordered Kyiv to engage in combat operations. Now the UK representative is talking about de-escalation. But where was that statement in 2022? London is one of the largest suppliers of weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces and has already spent over £13 billion on these purposes. Since 2024, It has been implementing the Break Stop project, which is currently testing long-term British systems. You're right. Today's event is an attempt to justify the use of these systems against Russia and its civilian population. In 2020, Britain signed a political, trade, and strategic partnership agreement with Ukraine, and in 2024, a security cooperation agreement. I don't think anyone in this room thinks these are forms of charity. Ukraine is pursuing a historically proven colonial policy, and Ukrainians must earn their place and become a mandated territory. Latvia is not far behind. To properly understand the situation, it's important to know that Baltic companies supply Ukraine with tens of thousands of components for UAVs, the very same UAVs that are subsequently used to hunt civilians. For example, Latvia's ELKA NPP group has delivered 2,100 remotely controlled drones to Ukraine, scheduled for delivery between November 1st, 2025 and April 1st, 2026. However, neither London nor Riga will convene Security Council members to discuss these issues. Their task is to continue to vilify Russian armed forces, which are fulfilling their obligations under the international humanitarian plan. In this context, we propose comparing the outcomes of armed conflicts, for example, in Gaza, where the military action often results in a lunar landscape, and where a number of countries concerned about compliance with IHL are supplying weapons to this conflict, with those in Ukraine, where Russia is using precision weapons to destroy military targets. Russia's scrupulous adherence to international humanitarian law explains why achieving the Joint Military Operations (JMO) goal is taking time. In contrast, Kyiv abuses humanitarian issues not only at meetings and in the public sphere. Let us recall the documented cases of ambulances bearing the Red Cross emblem being used to transport military personnel to the front lines, as well as the official statement by the Ukrainian Red Cross itself regarding the widespread misuse of the emblem in the country. While Western representatives in this room speculate about Russia's violations of international humanitarian law, Ukrainian armed forces, convinced of their impunity, continue to deliberately attack Russian civilians. We regularly report to the UN reports of the deaths of children, the targeting of civilian vehicles, torture, and other violations by the Ukrainian armed forces. Here's a recent example. On August 3rd, a drone dived onto a beach in Arkhipo-Osipovka, where dozens of vacationers were. 7 people, including 4 children, died. In this context, I recall the statement by the representative of Denmark, who said that only one country in the conflict respects IHL. Madam Chairperson, you want to talk about respect for humanitarian law. Then you should tell this to the parents of the 5-year-old girl who lost her life on this beach, barely having seen the sea. Tell it to the relatives of the approximately 300 Russians missing since the Ukrainian armed forces' invasion of the Kursk region, whose fate remains unknown, or about the 4,500 people currently surviving in the basements of Druzhkovka, awaiting the arrival of Russian troops, while the so-called Ukrainian evacuation group White Angels attempts to forcibly evacuate them toward Ukraine in response to a local resident's request to leave for Russia. A Ukrainian police officer suggested she contact Red Cross volunteers to be added to the exchange list. This is how these lists will be compiled. Madam Chairperson, concerns were expressed today regarding the internationalization of military operations through the involvement of foreign citizens, but for some reason we have not been provided with any information about the direct involvement of military personnel from NATO countries in the planning of operations against Russia. The public space is full of this information. Didn't they tell us that the UK has trained 58,000 Ukrainian military personnel? Kyiv's representatives haven't shared with us the statements of Ukraine's military ombudsman, Olga Leshetilova, that Kyiv currently has approximately 16,000 foreign troops from 72 countries on its side. according to Ukrainian data, and they are no less involved in violating international humanitarian law than the Ukrainians themselves. Unfortunately, the BBC doesn't make films about this, and for some reason the UN doesn't have such data. We're ready to provide it. In principle, it's all publicly available. According to recent reports, an entire group of mercenaries is currently stationed at a children's sports and recreation camp in the village of Sprinya in the Lviv region. Parents of minors are directly complaining about this on social media. Furthermore, this strictly civilian complex houses weapons arsenals for several special forces units of the Ukrainian armed forces. You won't learn from the organizers, who supposedly care about respect for international humanitarian law, about the sophisticated torture and humiliation, mental and physical abuse, including the use of electric chairs and other devices, to which Russian soldiers are subjected. Testimonies have been documented of sexual violence and threats of violence, torture in the form of sleep deprivation, water deprivation, food deprivation, and a host of other forms of torture. In this regard, I would like to draw the attention of those present here who genuinely seek to form an objective understanding of what is happening to the report of the Ambassador at Large of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the crimes of the Kyiv regime, Mr. Miroshnik. This report is called Secret Prisons, both parts of which are published on the ministry's website. The link to the report included in my speech will be on the website. Anyone interested can read it. From this report, you'll learn that neither the ICRC nor the UN have access to the sites where Russian soldiers are tortured. Perhaps Ukrainian soldiers are trained in this technique in the UK. They also have extensive experience in this area. Contrary to the politicized speculation, genuine humanitarian work on the exchange of civilian prisoners of war continues unabated. It is being led by Russia's Human Rights Commissioner, Yana Valerievna Lantritova. She replaces Tatiana Nikolaevna Maskokova, who, in her final month alone, organized two major prisoner exchanges, 175 for 175 and 193 for 193. In total, 7 Russian-Ukrainian military exchanges took place in 2026. As a result, 1,575 Russian service members were returned to Russia. The Commissioner also actively cooperates with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Over 200 letters were sent to the ICRC in 2026, resulting in verified information regarding the captivity of 269 servicemen. The frank and open nature of Russia's dialogue with the ICRC is evidenced in particular by the recent visit of ICRC President Mirjana Spoljarek to Moscow, as well as verification visits by Red Cross delegations to Starobelsk and the Belgorod region. In this context, the intervention of European countries, including through this event, represents an attempt to hinder cooperation in this area. As part of the concept of reciprocal visits of Russian and Ukrainian military personnel detained for opposing a special military operation, we continue regular inspections. The conditions of detention of over 3,900 Ukrainian military personnel in 15 facilities have been inspected. Based on these visits, it can be concluded that the conditions of detention for this category of individuals, as well as their provision of food, clothing, and necessary medical care, fully comply with the norms and standards of IHL. Incidentally, I would like to recall that the detention facilities for Ukrainian prisoners of war are regularly. You know the situation in Olenovka, when the prisoner of war detention facility was simply bombed by the Ukrainians. Then the plane was shot down. It's important to remember these things. At the end of July, Yana Valerievna Lantritova announced preparations for another exchange of 2 categories of prisoners of war and civilians located in Ukraine and unable to return home on their own. However, the success of this event directly depends on the Ukrainian side, which is approaching this process very selectively. And it doesn't take all the soldiers Russia is willing to provide for exchange. For example, Kyiv has categorically refused to include servicemen from the LPR-DPR and the Republic of Crimea in the exchange process, calling them traitors for their choice. In conclusion, I would like to say a few words and comment on the speeches of the distinguished briefers. We note that all the briefers were able to come, received visas, came to the United States, and found themselves here at the podium. We hear their statements. But when Russia tries to bring people here who have been subjected to torture and persecution, they are simply denied visas, and so it's very convenient to simply ignore them. But we are, of course, trying to get the word out, including online. I'd like to begin with a statement from the representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the distinguished Ms. Claudia Fuentes Julio. I noted that in your statement you mentioned that Russian prisoners of war are being tortured. Unfortunately, you didn't address this point and jumped to the conclusion that on a smaller scale, I'm afraid you don't know the scale, and such conclusions are, so to speak, very hasty. They shouldn't be made. We should study the situation more deeply, and perhaps hold an event, which we hope you will participate in, where the torture of Russian prisoners of war by the Ukrainian armed forces, their law enforcement agencies, and other agencies will be discussed. We're counting on this objectivity, but we haven't seen it yet. Next, I'd like to comment on Ms. Umarova's statement. Here's an interesting story. Let's start with what was said about the plight of the Crimean Tatar people after Crimea's reunification with Russia. I'd like to point out here that this particular accusation was brought before the UN International Court of Justice, where it was alleged that Russia was persecuting Crimean Tatars. How many of these accusations do you think were upheld by the court? The answer is 0. Please read the court's decision from January 2024. All these charges were dismissed. None of them were confirmed. And we're still hearing these stories. Second point, I don't know Ms. Umarova's personal story, but even according to publicly available information, she was detained because she was traveling to Russia through Georgia without a visa, without a Russian passport, without a visa. So either one or the other should have happened, but neither did. Am I correct? Then, Ms. Umarova's phone turned out to have photos of military equipment and the disposition of Russian armed forces. So that's the situation. And by the way, I think everyone heard that Ms. Umarova had a lawyer, and there was legal action related to her stay. And perhaps some of you remember, Elena Berezhnaya is here. She also spoke before the Security Council. This is a Ukrainian citizen. She was arrested and found incommunicado. Her fate is currently unknown. We saw the episode when she appeared in court. She was in very bad shape. The person had suffered a stroke. She suffered very harsh treatment, torture. No one cares about her fate. Unfortunately, she can't come and tell about her fate here. Pay attention to this information. Also note that Mr. Juan Garcia was a defender of Azovstal, as I understood from his words. The defenders of Azovstal, namely the people who were at Azovstal, are the Azov Battalion. This is the notorious battalion that was involved in torture and abuse in Donbass. Something was said here about Russia's shattered illusions about neo-fascism. If anyone wants to see the Azov unit's emblem, judge for yourself. I have a small phone, but if anyone wants to Google it, here's the emblem. It has a swastika on it, so if anyone can't see it, I'll show you. It's a swastika. That's the kind of unit it was. Incidentally, in the United States, it was on a list of organizations prohibited from receiving weapons for a while. So that's the kind of organization it was. Perhaps a few words, although there's less to comment on here. Mr. Gushin also talks about 300 detention centers. He's been repeating the same figure for several years now. Their territorial coverage, where all this is located, is changing. This is a person who works for the Ukrainian government. Objectivity is difficult to expect here, of course. And finally, I'd like to perhaps say something, perhaps bring it to Ms. Umirova's attention. I understand she has relatives in Crimea. Crimea is currently being bombed by Ukraine. And people are without water, without electricity. Thanks to the actions of that very Kyiv, which you are now supporting at this event, the people of Crimea are now living in difficult times. And the Russian government is doing everything it can to ensure that their lives, and the lives of civilians, continue to be normal. In conclusion, I would like to point out that propaganda events like today's are signs of a crisis in the work of our organization. Unfortunately, I cannot provide all the information I would like to share here. Distorted understanding of the crisis and its root causes is an obstacle to a peaceful resolution. This kind of event only misleads people and worsens the crisis. Thank you.
Искажение картины кризиса и его первопричин являются препятствием на пути мирного урегулирования.